The British Parliament buildings in London, Woolworth's headquarters in New York, and the Chicago Tribune building are notable examples of the secular application of Gothic iconography. Most notably, these massive outsized buildings were able to bypass the limiting structural properties of historic stone structures by hanging stones onto a modern steel frame structure, creating a pastiche of awkwardly proportioned buildings with misapplied faux Gothic church symbolism. More importantly, from an American perspective, we'll be looking at two authentic stone reproductions of English Gothic churches begun in the 19th century. St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City and the Cathedral of Saints Peter and Paul, also known as the Washington National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. Lastly, in contrast with the two massive great stone American cathedrals, we will look at a simple, inexpensive to construct rural Gothic or Carpenter's Gothic church. This economic wood church construction spread rapidly across the American landscape, coinciding more or less with the 19th century burn-over movement period of American Christian expansion. My home church, St. Mark's Episcopal Church, was consecrated in 1872. It is a beautiful example of the simple, well-proportioned board and batten Carpenter's Gothic Revival architecture. Let's begin by taking a look at the two great American stone revival cathedrals and then investigate the little wood rural church filled with stained glass that I love so much. The Gothic Revival was started and was said to be a return to true Christian architecture. In other words, it was a backlash against rationalism of the neoclassical period. And so Cinderella's Castle is probably the most famous Gothic building in North America. But I had to put it in here because there's a lot of elements of Gothic architecture. I don't see any flying buttresses, but there's the pinnacles and these conical towers and spires, pointed arches, and quatrefoil openings, but it's all made out of fiberglass on a steel frame. I just wanted to have that there to remind you of how widespread Gothic architecture is. And I found this quote by James Varicel. It says, "As we build, so we believe." Like I said, it's Cinderella's Castle may be the most popular church in North America right now. But now back to the real deal. About 1750 in UK, there was this building called Strawberry Hill House in Twickenham. It was the beginning of the Gothic Revival period. It has pointed arch openings and quatrefoil windows, pinnacles. Then it kind of spread. About 90 years later, one of the most famous neo-Gothic or Gothic Revival pieces, Houses of Parliament in London, 1840 to 1870. Not so much Twickenham, but Houses of Parliament and the next two buildings I'm going to show you, they're all steel frame. And the stone is not necessarily load-bearing. It's hung onto the steel frame, so the weight of the stone is carried onto the steel and onto the ground rather than the Gothic cathedrals where the blocks of stone rested on one another. Those are called load-bearing walls. These are an open web steel frame, and all that stone and glass is just hung on them. It has elements of Gothic architecture, the pointed arches, the pinnacles, flesh, a Gothic spire. One of the most famous to come to this, one of the two most famous that came to the United States was the Chicago Tribune building in 1923. It had pinnacles and it had flying buttresses. That's amazing. Again, it's a steel frame building, and the flying buttresses are kind of an artifact, as are the pinnacles. You know, they're not necessary structurally anymore. And then the Woolworth building, the same thing, pinnacles, and this probably, I guess you could call that a Gothic crown to it. And what I wanted to state is these buildings are steel frame, they're clad in thin stone veneer, and the stone is not load bearing. So you could go up 1,000,000 stories and hang the stone on as long as you could get the steel frame to stand. The compression issues that we've been talking about with the Gothic cathedrals and stone no longer comes into play. So you'll see here that, for example, there's pretty wide windows, flat windows, and you couldn't do that with structural stone. But we do have some beautiful buildings that I want to talk about in this country. Let's start with St. Patrick's Cathedral, one of the first cathedrals or Gothic Revival cathedrals. I think it's just absolutely gorgeous. It's in the cruciform plan, and oddly, the grid of New York City makes it so that St. Patrick's apse can face towards Jerusalem. That certainly is an accident. I'm sure they didn't lay the grid out that way, but St. Patrick's certainly is able to take advantage of that, having the sun come in the right place in the morning services. There's no tower or flesh at the crossing. That's not a commentary if something's wrong with it. It's just a commentary that this particular Gothic Revival building, they elected not to put a tower there. When we get to the Washington National Cathedral, there's a massive tower, but it does have the traditional towers in the front. This is one thing that's interested me. There's pinnacles you can see along edge of the building and in here, but there's no flying buttresses. And my guess is there's a roof over what would be the flying buttresses to help take the vault thrusts and stabilize the piers in the nave. I looked and looked and looked for section drawings or anything that would help me understand it, but I couldn't find anything, so I can't tell you for sure. This was built at a time when iron and steel construction was well known, and they could have used that to bypass the flying buttresses, but the National Cathedral uses them. St. Patrick's did not, at least visibly. And then the stone twin fleshes on the bell towers. The bell towers would probably be from here down and then, or maybe here down, and then these Gothic spires on top. And then the plan of this, it's a three-aisle cathedral. It has a side aisle, a nave, a side aisle. There's a narthex, transept, south portal, north portal, a raised bema, an altar. And this has a chevet, meaning that the side aisle can continue on around and back out. It looks like they probably blocked it off. Maybe, I don't know if those are steps or those are barriers. They have the chevet, and when we get to the National Cathedral, we see that they don't. And off of the chevet are, of course, chapels. You'll see those here. And then this, whenever you see this, I didn't talk too much, hardly at all about English Gothic, but common in English Gothic architecture is a lady chapel, which extends off the apse. And this is the lady it's dedicated to is the Virgin Mary, of course. And I was trying to think about this. Did the French have something called a lady chapel? You know what I'm saying? Chapelle, La Dame de la Chapelle or something that I couldn't think of ever seen that. Then I realized that the whole daggone cathedral's dedicated to the Virgin Mary. You know, it's Notre Dame, Our Lady. So the French gave the whole building over to the Virgin Mary, and the English built a lady chapel. So I learned something. And then these elements of Gothic architecture found their way across as well. We see the step buttresses. And I was looking carefully at this building. I was hoping it would show me something about flying buttresses, but it didn't. All I could find are these beautifully stepped buttresses. You see them on the sides here as well. And then inside, you can tell it's a deliberate English Gothic cathedral by the fan vaulting here and the stone fan vaulted nave. Absolutely beautifully done. The English tended to look at the ribbing as ornament. The French did not typically. And so what we have looking at this cathedral is a real cathedral. It has side aisles, it has a triforium, and it has a clerestory. So it's all the parts of a Gothic cathedral. Has pointed arches as well, a nave, an altar, an apse, and etc. It's really interesting because this was started before the Civil War, finished after the Civil War. The same architectural elements from Constantine's 4th century basilica churches are still in use 1700 years later. That's pretty amazing, and that's a testament to the people who built this, as well as the National Cathedral, about their fidelity to the Christian traditions. And so that takes us down to Washington, D.C. I'm going to talk a little bit about this, but I have just a small amount of knowledge. If you really want to know about this, Dick Mitchell's been a docent there, I think 12 to 13 years now, and he knows this cathedral better than anyone I know. But I'll do my best to introduce a few things. It's called the Cathedral of St. Peter and St. Paul, but it's now become to be known as the Washington National Cathedral. Started in 07 and finished more or less in 1990. It's a cruciform plan. It has a very long choir. That's unusually long. That may be typical for English, but not so much for French. What I wanted to show you is the plan, because it's a 3-aisle cathedral. And again, it's a authentic replication of a Gothic cathedral, in this case, English Gothic. Has a narthex, a north aisle, a nave, south aisle, south transept, the crossing where the massive tower is above, north transept, the choir in here, and back in here is an altar and an apse. I ran out of space, but there it is. And it's in the cruciform plan. And there's no chevet, no ambulatory. It's not a pilgrimage church. I'm not sure why St. Patrick's decided to do that, other than give access to the Lady Chapel, but they did not do that in Washington. And of course, they had this misfortune of the earthquake in 2011. And what's interesting about the earthquake is stone is not very good. It's one of the worst building materials for earthquake unless it's reinforced with steel. I was really surprised to see that some of this cathedral is not reinforced in steel. And you can see they're talking about putting pins in stone and resetting them, and steel clamps to reset stones, and then carving out places and epoxying in, I think, new stones and recarving them. It's, I think it's still ongoing, the restoration for this, but you can see how the shaking back and forth of the ground caused these pieces to shift and crack because they're very weak in tension. But nevertheless, it's an incredibly beautiful place inside. It has the beautiful transient light coming in from the stained glass windows, the beautiful rose windows, and the fan vaulting, typical of English Gothic cathedrals. This one has, for real, flying buttresses. The drainage troughs to the gargoyles are covered, pointed arched Gothic windows, and the rib vaulting. Okay, so there's the 3 structural elements of Gothic architecture, and St. Patrick brought in, and other Gothic churches in the United States, and certainly at National Cathedral. Pointed arches, flying buttresses, rib vaulting. You can see all those in these 3 photographs. And I always have to put a 4th element. It's not structure, and that's the stained glass. I don't want to leave without acknowledging one of the most incredible buildings ever built. It's still under construction. It was supposed to be finished 2026. It's Sagrada Familia in Barcelona. Now I've heard that date has been moved to possibly 2030 because of COVID. Some people told me they really don't like this. It looks like it's sand dripping or something like that. I just hope that anyone that gets a chance goes there and visits this place. It will leave your jaw on the floor. It's really an incredible thing. If Father Taylor gives me another hour, I want to do a presentation on this because it is so interesting how this building came to be developed. So I don't have enough time to talk about it today with the rest of the.
Just let me know when you want it, Ron.
Okay, thank you. Anyway, what makes this an American Gothic painting is it has a pointed arch window and it has board and batten siding. And that may look familiar to many of you at St. Mark's because we have the same thing here. And I want to talk a little bit about on the smaller scale of how the Gothic Revival came to the United States in the 19th century as well. And this, of course, is our church. The apse faces northwest, not towards Jerusalem, but towards Borman's Market. So we have to face what's important in our locale. We have pointed arch windows, and we have board and batten siding. This became known as the Carpenter Gothic or Rural Gothic vernacular. Sometimes they had horizontal siding as well, but board and batten was very popular. And you can see the cruciform plan. It was originally just the rectangular box, and then the transept and apse were added, giving it the traditional cruciform plan. And these are the components that give this building its Gothic lineage. It has a bell tower, steeply pitched roofs, rose window, and pointed arch windows, pointed arch doorway, porch. And the Gothic doorway and flanking windows make reference to a Gothic triportal cathedral main entrances. We don't have a 3-aisle cathedral, but it was very common to put 2 flanking windows beside a central doorway on these humble wood buildings. And there's a board and there's a batten. So just like Grant Wood's painting, here is our church's piece of American Gothic architecture. One thing is, I was fooling around with these drawings. I took a floor plan of Old St. Peter's Basilica. This is one of the first ever built. It was a 5-aisle basilica, meaning 4 side aisles and a nave, and transept and an apse. And I superimposed it with St. Mark's floor plan at the same proportion, not at the same scale. I mean, St. Mark's would fit, the plan, if it were at the same scale, would fit up in here. I mean, this is a huge, huge building, but proportionally, it's very close, I felt, proportionally to one of the original basilicas. So kudos again for St. Mark's and getting it right when they did this church. A lot of thought and care and love went into the construction and design. Just a few things. I took out the structural part about why there's tie rods, but from the inside, we have a bema, an altar, and apse. We have a tripartite Gothic stained glass windows. On the other end, we have a rose window and the tripartite Gothic arch narthex doors and windows and the rose window. So this kind of gives us a lineage directly back into the old Gothic churches. And we have the tie rods. I think those are added after the fact. They would have been popular in Italy to keep the walls from spreading out from the thrust of the vaults. But here we have a similar situation, and the tie rods were added. And then, of course, we have, I think, really an absolute marvelous set of stained glass windows that have added to gradually over the years. The latest, of course, is the one from retired choir director Rosemary. This is in the choir transept at the end. And a couple of words about that. These, I believe you would call them Art Nouveau windows from 1890 to 1910, the older window. They're organic forms and patterns that flow from one object to another. The stained glass artists juxtapose the Christian iconography anchored in a formal grid, meaning these icons from Christianity in this formal grid. You can see the grid there, against the floral organic forms of Art Nouveau design to make beautiful stained glass compositions. So the artists, designers of these windows was really playing off this Art Nouveau theme here and here against this rigid grid with holding these icons that have been held in place by the grid. And you can see that as we've added windows in the transept and the narthex, that has been respected. And we also had one window, only one window. It was in the old sacristy. It has a flat top. It's the only window that does, but the stained glass artist was savvy enough to put in a stained glass arch, and you hardly know that it looks out of place. By putting in that stained glass arch, it really fits in nicely with the rest of the compositions we have. And so that a beautiful little church out in the countryside of Maryland. While neoclassical and Gothic Revival churches have continued to more or less develop simultaneously in the United States, the Western world lurched towards self-immolation with the mass mechanized slaughter of the war to end all wars, now known as the First World War. Beginning in Switzerland, a reactionary art movement to the old world order, the movement known as Dada, developed into an artistic and architectural free-for-all as the rules of art are thrown out. In our final presentation of this series, we'll take a look at the results of what that throwing out of the old rules meant to the design of world church architecture.